Ok. Bom dia a todos que nos están acompañando.
Good morning to everyone who is tuned to us today. We are about to start our 10th webinar, and today we have simultaneous interpretation from English into Portuguese. I would like to start by introducing our two guests. I will switch to English soon, and let me know that we are streaming this webinar into the original language and another one into the interpretation language, which is Portuguese. This webinar is dedicated to study the life in the cities during pandemics. And that webinar would not be possible without the support that we are getting from nick.br. That is a supporter in our Solidarity publications, and nick.br is affording simultaneous translation, is our sponsor. Therefore, thank you so much to nick.br and all the dedication to our research, and thanks for their solidarity to help us to reach a higher number of participants, as we are being able to translate that into languages. I also like to thank the interpreters for making that possible. We are extremely happy to have here today two international guests.
Choosing to focus on today, life in the cities and pandemics. We're really pleased to have two speakers that we wanted to reach out to and we wanted to include as a part of the course. The first speaker, I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they'll be presenting. Sameh Wahba is the Global Director for the World Bank's Urban Disaster Risk Management Resilience and Land Global Practice. He's based in Washington, D.C. The global practice also covers issues of territorial development, geospatial, and results-based financing, and it has 30 billion in lending commitments and over 400 staff. Sameh has over 25 years of experience in urban development, land and housing, infrastructure, and sustainable development. Prior to joining the World Bank in 2004, he worked at the Institute of Housing and Urban Development Studies and the Harvard Center for Urban Development Studies. He holds a PhD and a master's in urban planning from Harvard University. Sameh has co-authored the World Bank flagship publications on public spaces and the hidden wealth of cities, urban land regeneration and culture in the city, reconstruction and recovery with UNESCO. We're also pleased to have with us, and the second person who will be presenting today is Judy Baker, who is the global lead urban poverty and housing and a lead economist in the global practice for social, urban, rural, and resilience at the World Bank in the Africa region. Judy has worked extensively across the World Bank on projects and analytical work, particularly in East Asia, Latin America, and South Asia. This work has covered topics related to urbanizations and its impacts, urban poverty, slum upgrading, service delivery, affordable housing, climate change, and impact evaluation. She has published 6 books as well as produced numerous country and regional reports. She has also been invited as a guest lecturer in a number of universities, both in the US and in developing countries. And I just want to add a special note that both Sameh and Judy also have worked in Brazil and have experience in Brazil. So it's a particularly honor to be welcoming them back to be a part of our class. And to also, as we've tried throughout this course, to try to draw lessons that are comparative and insightful, not only for Brazil, but to think about the pandemic in a global context and what we're learning. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sameh. Sameh, welcome.
Muito obrigado, Lorena. Bom dia para todas e para todos.
Thank you, Lorena. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I just would like to tell you that Once I was living in Brazil, everybody used to say that I am the most Brazilian Egypt person. So as it is so early in the morning over here, so I will switch back to English, and I'm sure that the translation will be wonderful.
Slides, please.
Yes, I'm starting them right now. One second.
Excellent. So both Judy and I worked together, and we wanted to give you a perspective of what's happening in cities in the context of COVID, how cities might fare post-COVID, and with a zoom in on slums, favelas, and bairros, which have been very much affected hotspots. Next slide, please. What COVID-19 has laid bare really were the inequities in the cities. Now, we're talking here about a pandemic of an unprecedented magnitude that has affected cities. I mean, globally, it has affected more than 60 million people with nearly 1.5 million deaths, but it has emanated in urban areas and has had a concentrated impact on urban areas. Next slide, please. In particular, it has caused the worst economic contraction even since before the Great Depression. I mean, we're talking probably 150 years since we've seen something of this magnitude. In the US alone, there's close to 40 million job losses. And of course, it impacts livelihoods at all fronts, small businesses, supply chains. Now, within cities, besides the fact that cities as a whole are affected by the contraction in economic activities, the informal sector has been really hit badly. There's somewhere between 1.6 to 2 billion informal workers globally, whose unstable incomes, irregular jobs, and lack of safety nets meant that they were hard hit. The numbers on the expectations of the poverty impact are really terrible. Even these numbers, we've revised them recently. We're now talking anywhere between 80 to 120 million people expected to be pushed into extreme poverty, and a bit less than 200 million people so-called new poor. By new poor, we mean depending on a variety of poverty lines that range between $3.5 and $5.5 a day, depending on the country. Now, this new poor is a bit different than the, if you will, the existing poor, in the sense that they are more likely to be urban, they're more likely to be a little bit better educated, although within cities, it's those with lesser educations that have been worse affected, and they're likely to be working with irregular jobs. Cities as well have been badly hit, and we forecast in many of the cities we work with, whether in Morocco, in Romania, in South Africa, cities that we've spoken to, we forecast drops in revenues of anywhere between 15 and 30% of annual revenues. Next slide, please. Now, in the developing world, cities that have limited capacity and have limited public investments have been particularly hit. So when you look at the cities that have had a large majority of the cases, they are the cities that have limited livability, little public space, poor housing conditions, and absent infrastructure services. Next slide, please. Another issue that has affected city has been, as I mentioned, the reduction in economic activity. So with the advent of COVID-19, cities and national governments have started imposing policies such as lockdowns, and you can see the impact very clearly when you look at the nightlights of a city. So this is the city of Wuhan, when different in the intensity of the nightlights. You see the right-hand slide is much dimmer than the left-hand picture, and that's only 2 weeks apart because of the beginning of the lockdowns. Next slide, please. Now, when the pandemic hit us, we were told to self-isolate, we were told to socially distance, and lockdown policies were introduced. Now, is this feasible everywhere? Is everybody equally worse off? Next slide, please. In cities that are well planned, like Seoul, like Singapore, etc., where you have ample public space. Can I ask those that are not muting, please to mute, because I'm hearing an echo. Yes, you can say it with this slide. No, thank you, Lauren.
Okay.
So in cities that look like this, that have good infrastructure, that have decent quality housing, that have public spaces, that have infrastructure for broadband, it might be easy or doable to self-isolate, to socially distance, because you have the space and the conditions to do that. Next slide, please. But this is not the case everywhere. There are many places that look like this, where there are neither housing conditions, nor infrastructure conditions, nor public space, nor infrastructure and broadband connectivity to allow you to work from home. And in these places, it is not feasible to socially distance. Next slide, please. Slums and informal settlements, in particular, are at high risk. There's about 1 billion people living in slums and informal settlements, and they have all the conditions that make it hard to socially distance and to stay safe in between the high population density in substandard and overcrowded housing, the poor infrastructure services, crowded transport, and lack of public space. Judy is going to take a deep dive into the slums, so I will not dwell a lot over here. Next slide, please. First, I wanted to share with you some work that we've done at the World Bank, work to try to predict the hotspots for COVID-19. So what you have in front of you are images from Mumbai. And what we had was, number one, high resolution satellite imagery. Number two, data and information on population density, on building heights, and on the location of public infrastructure. When you put those things together, we can construct basically a three-dimensional image of the city, and we know the amount of available floor space, and we know the distribution of population density through population grids. So we can calculate theoretically where are the neighborhoods within a city where people might not have enough space to socially distance. That's basically, you take the floor space, you divide it by the population density, and it's less than 3.5 or 3 square meters per person, which is more or less a 2-meter radius or a 2-meter square, if you want. And these would be the places that we would anticipate would be hotspots for COVID-19. Next slide, please. And this is the image that results. On the left-hand side, these are the hotspots in Mumbai as a result of density and the lack of public space. And then we add a second layer, which is information on where do we have public toilets, public water taps in places that lack infrastructure, maybe, dense markets, maybe, bus stations that are particularly overcrowded. And we create another layer where the infrastructure becomes a potential hotspot for COVID-19 transmission. And this becomes the slide on the right. Now, yes, so, yes, next slide, please. Yeah. So what's happening over here, I mean, we've heard a lot of people blame population density being the reason for COVID-19 hotspots and its transmission. That's not really the case, because you have cities like, as I mentioned, Singapore, Seoul, etc., that have managed to cope very well with COVID-19 despite having high population density. And in fact, Manhattan that we've just seen, Mumbai that we've just seen, has the same population density as Manhattan. However, Manhattan has 4 times the floor space that Mumbai has, which means all else equal, a person in Manhattan has 4 times the space that the person in Mumbai has to self-isolate. So it's not really about density, but it's more about the way density is actually managed, meaning it's when density that is livable becomes density that is about overcrowding. These are the conditions, such as in this image, the poor living conditions, the overcrowding, that becomes the vector for contagion. Next slide, please. The other thing is also the poor cannot afford to stay at home and work from home or learn from home. So that's another situation related to the livelihoods situation. Next slide, please. And we've done some analytics, and in the city of Jakarta, where we've measured the mobility of people, and we've compared this mobility by income group, we've discovered that after COVID-19 lockdowns were introduced, the rich managed to stay in their home and reduce their mobility much more significantly than the poor. So it's the poor really that cannot afford to stay at home. Next slide, please. And now, why is that? I mean, mainly it is because slums and the reality of them is that they are a trade-off between economic opportunity and livability. What does this mean? It means that the poor, in their choices in moving into the city, either choose to live close to where the jobs are, such as in an image like this one. These are those slums in that middle, in the flood-prone area. They want to live closer to the city center, but the only available lands out there are basically flood-prone areas, landslide-prone areas, environmentally sensitive areas such as wetlands or garbage dumps, and these are the only available unsettled locations that they go and live in. And in this case, they'd be choosing economic opportunity over livability. Of course, the other option is to go and live very far away from the city center, where they might find affordable land and housing, and here they'll have livability, but at the expense of opportunity, because they have to go back and forth in commutes of 2 to 3 hours per day. So that trade-off between economic opportunity and livability that the poor particularly face is because, you know, of the dysfunctional land and housing markets that exist within a city. Next slide, please. Now, going back to the cities. Now, cities today are operating on 3 different dimensions as they cope with COVID-19. On the one hand, they are intervening in citywide emergency measures to try to contain the virus and to care for the affected population. Then they try to focus with specific targeted actions on the particularly most affected people to care for them. And then they start planning for recovery. Let me go into a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. Cities have to, as part of their attempts to reduce the transmission of the virus, they have to regulate the use and operation of both public and private facilities, public spaces, and services and establishments. So one, they have to differentiate what are essential services that need to continue running versus non-essential services, private establishments that may need to close because they might be vectors for transmission. So restaurants, etc., would need to be closed. Other public facilities like stadiums, community center, libraries might need to be retrofitted to become additional health facilities. Public spaces might need to be adjusted for social distancing. Mobility throughout the city also might need to be improved. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of the supply chains and the delivery of essential services, these are also critical functions of the city. Within lockdowns, you still have to have garbage collected, you still have to have food delivered to markets, pharmacies and supplies, medical supplies delivered, and testing equipment happening. Cities have to run all this equation as well. Next slide, please. In particular, with working with COVID, they have to provide, and complement national health services in terms of the testing, but also targeting those specific potential hotspots with additional water points, with additional, public toilets, with additional targeted medical services. Next slide, please. These are the citywide actions, and then they have to zoom in to focus on specific segments of the poor and the vulnerable. They have to provide social safety nets for the poor, whether in the form of cash transfers, in the form of food distribution. They need to focus on children who particularly relied on school, not just for education, but for nutrition, by availing food for children as well, to ensure that stunting does not happen. In some cases, availing Wi-Fi access to enable online education, water, sanitation, and hygiene programs, and then targeted health services with poorer communities. And then in addition, as a way of trying to jumpstart livelihoods, to think about labor-intensive public works, where you can avail cash for works for low-income households whose livelihoods have been disrupted in the types of activities that are, if you will, within the norms of public health, of social distancing, etc. Next slide, please. And the thing is, cities have to do all this in a context where their revenues are declining. So they're doing their jobs, an increased amount of work in conditions that might warrant additional cost, yet they have lower resources. Next slide, please. Now, let me walk you a little bit quickly into what might be a new normal post-cities, and then Judy is going to take you into the deep dive on slums. Next slide, please. The first obvious thing that we've learned is that there will be a need to rethink land use planning and zoning regulations. Now, infrastructure standards, as far as slums and informal settlements are concerned, facilities that have proven to be magnets or spreading points for zoonotic diseases like abattoirs, like wet markets, would need to have regulations for their siting, for operating them safely. Public space design parameters, wider sidewalks, more open spaces, rethinking occupancy and crowding thresholds in facilities, restaurants, markets, in housing, in office occupancy to try to reduce overcrowding. And then thinking about how do you plan the peri-urban areas and the linkages between rural and urban settlements. Next slide, please. Of course, goes without saying that there will need to be a scaled up investment in slum upgrading. And this is not just to reduce the inequalities in the city. It's not just to impact, to address the impacts of climate change, because these are the flood prone, landslide prone areas that face increased disaster, but it's also to tackle the increased contagion risk that exists in unsanitary housing and infrastructure conditions. Next slide, please. But talking about slum upgrading alone without talking about housing does not work, because you will always be running after the problem. If we're only fixing slums and not thinking about tackling the problems of access to land and housing, to give formal land and housing for low and limited income households, then you're always running after the problem to fix without anticipating it. Next slide, please. There will need to be quite a bit of rethinking of mobility, adaptation of public transit. So as I mentioned, many cities, the city of Auckland is widening sidewalks. Cities like Auckland, Paris, Bogota are creating additional bicycle lanes, Chennai as well, by taking away from the right of way for roads to give for cycling. And then there's lots of investment into trying to sanitize public transit, public spaces, etc., to reduce contagion risk. Of course, the finances of public transit are getting affected as well. So here in Washington, D.C., we're starting to hear that maybe, the system might emerge, but having to cancel services on weekends, reduce frequency of trains running during peak hours because of the deficits that are getting created. So in many ways, rethinking mobility with adding methods such as walking and cycling that are non-motorized, taken to another extreme, of course, by cities that are rethinking the so-called 15-minute city, like Paris, like Milan, like Helsinki, like many other cities, thinking about how can they meet many of the needs of their residents within close proximity of the neighborhoods that they live in, which, if I may say, is nothing new from a planning perspective. That's the age-old neighborhood planning unit concept. But there's an important revival for thinking about proximity within city. Next slide, please. A big dimension that was revealed, a big gap that was revealed, was the lack of preparedness of cities and regional development agencies as far as the ability to manage emergencies, to be prepared for them, and to respond to them. Now, having operating centers, emergency operating centers, where information is availed, where there is intersectoral coordination, where there is coordination across jurisdictions, are critical. And how do you strengthen cities' abilities to cope with disasters and pandemic like this? And it's not just about cities, it's also about communities. I mean, we've seen advances in the field of preparing and responding to disasters from natural hazards. So you see communities having drills to prepare that if there's a cyclone, what do you do? If there's an earthquake, what do you do? But how do you prepare in a context of a pandemic? How do you think about, closures, mobilities, isolating, about contact tracing, about targeting medical support is something that has taken cities by surprise and will require important preparation. Next slide, please. Quite a few cities are starting to rethink their supply chains for having a bit more self-sufficiency. So cities that have been reliant on far away supply chains, relying on food imports, on imports of essential goods and services from rather remote places that saw disruptions to their supply chains, are starting to think about proximity, about more flexible contracting models, about maybe manufacturing and agriculture closer to city boundaries, whether it's a peri-urban area or even thinking about urban agriculture. We're seeing, poorer communities also whose food security was affected, think about that, and thinking about improving rural-urban linkages and thinking about how food accesses and is distributed into the city, and the so-called food desert places that are have absence of food. Next slide, please. This is an obvious one, the importance that many cities and national governments have figured out on improving digital infrastructure so that you can have a better coping mechanism for things like work from home, study from home, etc. Next slide, please. But there are two important unknowns that will shape the city of tomorrow. One is how will the trade-off between the benefits and the cost of urban density pan out? And these two images are those extremes. On the one hand, there are benefits to urban density when density is managed well. It is about access to jobs, it's about access to amenities, it's about access to specialized services, economies of scale in the delivery of services, its productivity, its knowledge spillovers, its innovation. That's the good side of cities when urbanization is managed well. The bad side of cities when urbanization is not managed well are the favelas, are the places where a lack of affordable housing creates different and poorer living conditions. It's places in the city where you might have congestion, where you might have pollution, where you might have crime and violence or high contagion risk. Of course, the speed by which, if you will, the return to normal will happen will dictate which of those two parameters and the evolution and acceleration of trends during this period will also dictate how will this trade-off pan out. Next slide, please. And then the second dimension, of course, is the future of work. Now that we have spent much time in telework, in tele-studies, etc., what will the future of many of those functions be? Now, is it going to be the end of the central business district? Now, I've seen about 2-3 days ago, a new study that came out from Ernst & Young with the Urban Land Institute, spoke to about 550 players in the real estate market, real estate developers, investors, large corporate users, etc. And the general perception is there will be a decline in demand for office space. Big corporate employers will want to ensure a certain amount of office space, but have a flexibility of adjusting their needs accordingly. There is an expectation there will be an increase in telework, but at the same time, there are real concerns in the loss of corporate culture, into the loss of innovation, into the loss of the ability, to create a whole that's much more than the sum of its parts through people coming together, and also issues related to the mental well-being, etc. So it's not a done deal, but there is an expectation that there will be an increase in telework, and as a result, maybe in the short term, demand for office space will not increase. It might actually increase. There will be a rethinking about how leases are structured, but then in the medium and long term, there's an expectation that there will be adjustments, that there will be much more of a demand for different type of office space that affords more space per person, much more collaborative office spaces, collaborative work type spaces, and places where there is a mixity of uses. It's no longer about the city center, it's about urban regeneration, it's about access to mixed use activities, public spaces, etc. And this is where I am foreseeing cities going in the future. The fact that cities, or the preconization that cities were about labor markets, is going to more or less decrease in importance. because of the acceleration that is expected in technologies such as home-based work, etc. And what will make cities and will set them apart will be in many ways their livability, the public spaces, the parks, the amenities, cultural amenities, the services, the quality of education that cities can offer. These will be the magnets that will attract people into living in the cities. But then, because of the importance of these services, these amenities, these public spaces, etc., there will be a lot of essential functions that are needed for the maintenance and upkeep and operation of these magnets, if you want. So you will need, in restaurants, for every chef, you'll need, labor out there, to wash the dishes, to work in the kitchen. You'll need, garbage collection. You'll need nurses and doctors in the hospitals. These are in-person jobs. So you need your essential services running, and many of these essential services will be performed by, low and moderate income households. And then, to the extent that the cities will be able to accommodate them, to afford them with affordable housing, to afford them with safe commutes to access their jobs, then these essential services that are critical for the running of a city will be operating, and then cities will thrive. So again, cities will thrive through a combination of livability, but equally important will be the important dimensions of inclusion to ensure that a city is diverse, is inclusive, has its essential functions, services, etc., running for a more prosperous future. So with that, thank you very much on my end. And Judy is going to take you into a deep dive into slums, which are the most affected areas of COVID-19. Judy, over to you, please.
Bom dia, é prazer a apresentação.
Good morning. It's a great honor to be here today with all of you.
Yes, and for my presentation, I'm going to switch to English. It is a pleasure. So as Sameh said, today I'm going to cover some of what's happening in slums. We have been compiling what cities are doing since the beginning of the pandemic. It's become a compilation that's got many examples from the media and from our teams to see how cities are responding and how especially they're trying to reach those that are most vulnerable. One of the things that really struck me and continues to surprise me is how everybody is responding so differently. So even here in the United States where I live and in many of the countries where we work, the responses have been very tailored to the conditions on the ground. Many of them have been coming from communities, some from local governments who are playing a very important role in addressing this pandemic, and then of course from the national level. So today the idea is to just walk you through a few of these examples with a particular focus on issues around livability and vulnerable groups, many of whom are in slums. Next slide, please. So just to touch upon something that Sameh brought up, but I'll go over it again because it's very important, is really why are slums at high risk? The first issue is around the high population densities and within slums. So you tend to have a lot of people living in a very compact area with little space, little public space. People don't have yards, or if they do, they're very small. And then within households, you also have a lot of overcrowding. So large families living in very small spaces. These two factors make it very difficult to social distance. We also know that the living conditions, things like limited access to basic water and sanitation, drainage, even things like roads to be able to get in and out of areas, make it difficult to distance and make the transmission of pandemics such as COVID much more rapid. When you don't have a place to wash your hands with clean soap and water, or to use a toilet, it becomes vectors for disease spread. We know that also in slums, the access to health services is limited. Sometimes you have small clinics, but generally they're very limited. They're not staffed with large numbers of people. Accessing hospitals is quite expensive and difficult for people. We also know that many of the people that live in slums rely on crowded transport services to get to work. So it's in many countries you have what you call tuk-tuks, little vans or small buses where people are just crammed in close contact with each other, and that is a big spread of disease. We also know that most of the urban poor work in the informal sector, and that means that they don't have proper protective equipment for themselves. They are put in conditions that are working in conditions that where, again, it's impossible to social distance. They're potentially in areas that are crowded. So there's a number of things about working in the informal sector that poses risk. And the other big challenge is that there are no social programs to fall back on. So you don't have unemployment insurance or safety nets if you're working in the informal sector because it's informal. And so you're not considered part of the formal system. And then finally, there's a lot of, in many of the cities where we're working, it's a large share of the population. So it is a group that deserves a lot of attention, especially as we think about this pandemic. And many cities, unfortunately, have not been able to address the challenge. Some of it is related to political will, and some of it is because of capacity and resource constraints. Next slide. So as mentioned, I'm going to just highlight a few points related to livability and vulnerable groups, sort of drilling down on what Sameh has presented. Next slide, please. So the first one is really around vulnerable populations and how to reach them. So the types of vulnerability really differs from country to country, but there are a few characteristics that one could say are really the same. So we know, again, what we're seeing in our examples and what we're finding on the ground is that migrants and refugees are really being hit hard because they are typically new to a place. They don't have identity in a particular city. So it makes them ineligible for accessing social programs. Their living conditions are often poor and temporary. Many live in camps, which you can imagine, similar to slums, make the spread of disease very high. Women have emerged as a very vulnerable group for many countries. And part of that is because a lot of them have been the first to lose their jobs. So they're not bringing in income for the household. And another big challenge that's been emerging is the rise in domestic violence. It's gone up in so many places because people have nowhere to go. They're all stuck at home and there's high tension. And anybody who has a history of domestic abuse has been, it's very prominent right now for many. And then finally, children. So they're losing out not only on the learning, which potentially will have impacts for the rest of their lives. And some of them are not able to access any kind of education during this period, and it's extended for a long time now. The second one is, as Sameh mentioned, around nutrition. So many children rely on school feeding programs. and they're not getting that nutrition. Many are going hungry, and this is emerging as a major problem. And then the final piece really for children is around social development. Children need interaction with others to have their emotional and social development, and many are missing out on that. And then we see that housing is a particular problem for accessing right now. Many cannot pay rent. Now, a number of countries have put moratoriums on rent payments, but many people are being evicted and becoming homeless, which is causing a major problem on top of the existing problem. So I think initially many cities had programs, landlords were able to temporarily put a pause on rent payments, but now it's been extended for a long time and many cannot afford to continue to do so. Now, that being said, there are some programs that are adapting. So we mentioned temporary holds on rent collection. We've seen in many places hotels that are opening up for shelters. Some of that is financed by municipalities. And there are even apps that have been developed to help vulnerable people find temporary housing. Next slide. To give you an example, we mentioned the vulnerable groups of refugee camps. So we've seen some NGOs and international organizations are trying to put in place measures to protect those in refugee camps and contain the spread of COVID. So some have constructed isolation and treatment facilities. They have, in some places, very strict regulations, which may seem harsh, but it's important to keep people from being exposed to others that may have COVID that live in other areas. So they're saying, no, if you're going to go and shop or even go to work, there are going to be restrictions to make sure that people are not bringing the disease back to the camp. There's also been a lot of efforts to distribute masks and soaps and trying to acquire medical equipment through various funding sources to be able to react. And then finally, there's also some interesting experiences in large refugee camps where they're monitoring some of as it sort of goes back to the hotspots that Sameh was talking about, the areas where people congregate, whether it's a water hole or a public space. They're closely monitoring that to contain the spread. Next slide, please. The second big area, it's hugely important, is around jobs and livelihoods. We know that one of the biggest impacts that has come out of this pandemic is the loss of jobs and livelihoods for so many. And this is particularly strong in urban areas. We know that it's the urban poor that have been hit the hardest. We have global numbers that show us that. They are taking up a large share of what we're calling the new poor. So these are people that maybe were just over the poverty line, but because of the pandemic and the job losses have fallen into poverty. So to address this, many countries are taking different approaches. And I think we are just seeing the beginning of this. Going forward, this will be a priority for the economic and social recovery in so many countries, is how to get people back to work. So the first is many countries have labor-intensive public works programs. And these have a long history, including in Brazil and other places in Latin America, investing in infrastructure that would have been built anyway, or in improving cities through clearing drains to reduce flooding, and cleaning up, doing some of the sanitation you saw in the public transport areas. There's a number of things that require a lot of labor. They're unskilled jobs, but they're an important vehicle for transferring resources to low-income populations. And within our own projects at the World Bank, we are doing a lot of adapting programs to make sure that we can create more jobs through the work that we do. Where we can use labor instead of machines, we are trying to make sure that people are having access to some kind of livelihoods. A second area is this whole notion of build back better. So a lot of cities are thinking about, well, you know, this is our opportunity. We saw great examples from Sameh's presentation about using bike lanes and rethinking the city. So as they do that, there's been a real focus on sustainability and green stimulus programs, and many of those also can be done to create jobs. So it's been a big priority. We also know from the pandemic, this has sort of highlighted the longstanding demand for affordable housing. And the creation of housing is actually a very important creator of jobs in cities. We know that the job multiplier for housing, the housing sector, is very high. There are some cities that are exploring, well, maybe now is the time to work with the private sector and invest more in affordable housing, with a specific goal of obviously increasing the opportunities for low-income housing, but also it's an opportunity to create jobs. There have been programs to support small and medium enterprises. So this comes in the form of grants and microloans. A lot of these programs don't reach the poorest. Typically, you need some kind of collateral. So the small vendor who's got a food stall somewhere, it's difficult to access these funds. But in some cases, working through NGOs, some of these grants are being made available to help people stay employed. And then finally, there's obviously a hugely important piece of this is making sure that municipalities are able to continue to do their jobs, to deliver services, to do the investments that they would have, even as revenues are down. And so there are programs, government programs, to make sure that local governments continue to have the resources that they need to keep their economies moving and to continue with the investments that are needed. Next slide, please. So just to give you a couple of examples on cities that are doing interesting things to create job opportunities. So the first one is Cape Town. This started pre-COVID. So they are investing in retrofitting housing in low-income neighborhoods. So taking dilapidated houses that are at high risk to natural hazards and investing in them to improve them structurally and make them more livable. So to do that, they're training and hiring people from poor communities. There's a pilot project that, for example, to give you a sense of how much job creation there was, where they they improved 2,000 homes that cut emissions from these homes, and it created more than 2,300 jobs. So a significant impact. And there's the example in Kenya of the slum upgrading program. That's a program where I am working, and there's been a long-standing program that's quickly adapted under COVID. It partnered with the National Hygiene Program in the country, where the explicit goal was to provide jobs, especially for unemployed youth. And they're doing things like street and drainage clearing, collecting garbage, disinfecting. But they worked with the existing programs to actually reach those that are most in need. And now we're looking at how to scale this up and do construction of some of the infrastructure that's needed in slums, things like public spaces and community infrastructure, whether it's a community center or a small health clinic or a school or footpaths. And again, all of these with the explicit goal of creating jobs. Next slide, please. The third area again, critical is around food security. So this is something that has been amazing to me, how widespread the impact has been. So in many of the countries that I'm working in the developing world, it's not so surprising, but I can say that here in the US, the demand for food is because people don't have enough resources to buy groceries has been enormous. We see lines and lines of people in different parts of the country, and I'm sure it's similar in Brazil, looking for some kind of assistance. So this is where, again, there's been a lot of creative solutions. So at the neighborhood level, community kitchens and food banks have really ramped up. They're banding together to buy food in bulk. They're delivering to people at home, especially to vulnerable populations like elderly or disabled that can't go out. Market spaces have been adapted. So in many of the countries where everything still relies on big food markets, they're extending hours and they're putting in social distancing measures so that you avoid the very, very crowded spaces that you would have typically in a market. There's been an increase in space, making space and adapting existing spaces for neighborhood gardens in cities so that people can feed themselves. There's been distribution of ration cards and a lot of emphasis on prioritizing supply chains to make sure that food is getting to cities and to the people from rural to urban areas, to the people that are in need. Next slide, please. So I just want to highlight the example in Quito, where there have been a lot of different pieces that are quite interesting, where it's coming from both local organizations, government, and private. So the first one is overall investing in improving some of the markets and the retail distribution, which I think was planned anyway, but they've prioritized that to keep the supply chains open. There have been introducing price controls to avoid speculation as there have been shortages. We talked about these examples of regulating shopping hours at markets so that you spread people out so they're not all in one place at one time. Special permits to allow food to be transported during the lockdown when people were not supposed to be out and about. Distributing food to vulnerable populations, especially those that are already set up with social programs. Though, of course, as we understood before, for those vulnerable groups that are not registered, these are the kinds of populations that fall through the cracks. There are maps of Quito's food system that had been developed before the pandemic, so they've been able to use those for targeting. And then finally, there's been a lot of collaboration between the private sector, local governments, and the donors to work on the delivery and grants for food. Next slide, please. So at the heart of so many of these responses has been communities. The communities are where perhaps we're seeing the most response, and it's not surprising because people take ownership of their own situation and they find solutions that work for themselves, for their families, and for their living environments. So some of those examples include fundraising, using existing credit groups that might exist in favelas to help specific groups in need. People have been working together to access supplies. They are mobilizing to make and distribute masks and homegrown hand sanitizer. We've seen all kinds of examples of that. There's bartering. I know there's been interesting examples, I think, coming from Colombia, or even just on using apps, people are sharing and exchanging basic information and goods and services so that they don't have to go out or trying to adapt when they can't get a hold of something that might be in need. There have been a lot of efforts to raise awareness and share information. Many people, especially at the beginning, have been skeptical about the pandemic and they're not sure what to believe. So it's the communities, the community leaders, health workers that are really able to provide the most compelling information, the most credible information to let people know what's happening and how to protect themselves. There have been people in communities that are enforcing the quarantines. So, you know, again, health workers, community leaders that are saying, no, you need to stay home. It's the only way to avoid the spread of the disease. And we are here to enforce curfews. Next slide. So the next example just shows a few things that are happening in India, where the role of communities is quite high. They have a long history of community activism. So in Kerala, for example, some of these groups have quickly set up community kitchens and distributed relief using existing women groups, self-help groups. Their women's groups are doing a lot of outreach to help with the domestic violence that I mentioned is increasingly a problem. Different community groups are organizing to collect donations. And then in a couple of other cities, in Ahmedabad and Pune, there are local groups that are working on finding shelter, housing, and food for really the people that are desperate and are not able to access government resources, public services, but need dire help. Next slide, please. Then I want to highlight the importance of information in all of this. It is, I think, more than ever emerging as such an important way to keep us informed, help us know what to do and how to navigate these difficult times. So again, we've seen some really innovative solutions from low-income groups where they've been doing public awareness campaigns. Many countries have put superstars on television to give the messages about, you know, quarantining, staying home, washing your hands, wearing your mask. There have been songs and using apps to get the messages out. Buenos Aires is a good example where they've set up an app to answer public questions and help people be referred to public resources for medical help. There's the WeChat platform has been set up to connect hospitals and doctors with services that might be needed. There are apps for contact tracing. So a lot of these kind of innovations around information have been used. And just to give you the next slide, an example from Brazil, we know that in Rio, in the favelas, they have established a dashboard to track COVID in I guess, 120 neighborhoods, including 1,000 poor neighborhoods. Where community members are keeping track themselves of what's happening. And this has turned out to be a very helpful tool for tracking the spread. So a lot of different kinds of solutions, creative solutions, highlighting the importance of having good information to address the pandemic. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about building back better, I want to leave you with something that it's not a magic bullet, but it is one of the solutions that can have long-lasting impacts on households, communities, and cities, especially for the urban poor. So we know there's been a lot of research looking at slum upgrading programs. Brazil has a very long and successful history of investing in low-income communities to improve them. We know that through investing in infrastructure, in communities, through using participatory methods to make sure people have a say in their communities, there have been a lot of positive impacts. So one of them is on improved health outcomes. So overall, people are healthier if they have clean water, if they're not surrounded by environmental hazards around trash that can spread disease. We also know that investing in slums can increase livelihood opportunities. Many people work from home. So having a better living environment, better access to transport, better access to water and sanitation, to electricity can help you with your home-based work. There are, again, a lot of great examples. Once the community begins to improve, people will find resources to invest in their own homes to make them better. We know that once the roads are potentially widened and connected with tertiary roads, there can be better access to transport and jobs, and especially important for Brazil and elsewhere in Latin America, we've seen substantial reductions in crime and violence with investments in communities. It can be things like better lighting, better fencing, and better awareness. People feel more vested in their communities. A few lessons that we've learned over the years about doing slum upgrading is, first of all, it's best to keep people in their communities when possible. Of course, sometimes people will be in precarious areas, whether it's steep hillsides or in flood-prone areas or by dump sites, and they need to be moved. But it is preferable to keep them as communities. Typically, they have settled where they are because they're close to jobs. And we've seen a lot of mistakes of trying to move people far away to maybe nicer housing, but there aren't services and jobs. So it's important to look at that. A second big lesson is around the role of community participation. We've learned so much about how important letting communities take a lead role in determining what those communities should look like, has really contributed to the successful design and implementation of programs. Next slide, please. We've also learned that a lot of these programs may be national level, but it's critical to include local governments in the determination of how programs should be shaped. Otherwise, you end up with what we call islands of improved areas and neighborhoods, but they're not connected to the city. So making sure that local governments have a seat at the table from the beginning, are driving much of the connection with communities about how to improve slums is critical. On land titling, we didn't talk much about tenure security, but it is obviously a big challenge for so many living in slums. And we know that investing in tenure security is probably one of the most difficult things that we do. Land is a scarce resource in cities. One of the things that we've learned is it's not a black or white situation that you have land title or you don't. There's quite a gray area where you can give some people different kinds of security of tenure over time so that eventually you get to secure tenure, complete secure titling. But you can start with something that is gradual, and sometimes that is less daunting for city managers. We also have learned that coming in with flexible standards is very important to adapt to local needs. So we don't come in. I've seen many countries that say, no, this is how it has to be done. This is how we want our cities. But if you don't adapt, you can't really generate communities that work for people living in them. Also, we talked about the importance of bringing communities into the city so that they're not isolated areas that have been improved. And then finally, to say that public spaces, in investing in them in communities, can really transform neighborhoods. So whether it's a football field or it's a public space to open up for markets, to, especially under the pandemic, this has been super important so people can go for health services or to buy and sell their goods, making sure that these areas are well lit and well placed has been very important. So with that, I will stop and last slide, and thank you and look forward to any discussion. Obrigada.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Sameh and Judy, for excellent presentations. I wanted to start maybe by posing one of the first questions that has come across from the students and the faculty who are participating in the course, and relay some of those questions to relay a little bit of the questions that have arisen. One, and I'm going to add a little bit more to it, inserting some information about what we're learning on the ground in Brazil, is there a danger with what's happening? We're seeing in Brazil some trends with reverse migration of, for example, Korean and Chinese immigrants whose countries are more stable pandemic settings are initiating reverse migration back to their homelands. And at the same time, there's clearly a pattern that in cities have become very dangerous places where the risk is higher. So we are seeing elites leave cities to rural areas and to their vacation homes or to areas that are more rural. So one question, as we talk about the issue of cities struggling and finances also requiring increases in taxes, is cities will have to increase land taxes to raise resources to finance some of the investments to make cities safer. Is there a risk that we're going to have this issue of cities trying to provide incentives for the wealthy or the elites to stay in cities? And how is that going to affect the ability of cities to be more responsive or to be more inclusive in the types of investments they're willing to make, because they might have to actually accommodate and ensure to secure elites staying in cities, and that might divert resources that should be spent in lower income communities, but in order to keep elites in cities, that might create a tension. So I think that's one issue that was discussed. And then a related issue to that is we're seeing a lot the challenges of city governments versus state governments versus the national government, and how much cities are able to implement and control their own populations are contingent a lot on the national and regional structure in which they're immersed. And so I'm wondering if you could comment on also those challenges and what insights have emerged from other countries and other experiences. So I don't know if those two help get us started with the conversation, and then I can add a couple of others, and also the other faculty I'm sure have other questions to add.
Maybe I can get started, and Judy, you can add in. So on the point of, if you will, the exit of the elite from the city, and how do you finance the infrastructure improvements that are needed without, let's say, revenues, etc. So one, I think the thesis on the exit of the elites from the city is overblown and is still not documented. I mean, there are housing markets where values remain unaffected. I mean, I think probably the only market where we've heard a little bit about that was in the height of the pandemic in Manhattan, the exit of, if you will, the wealthy from Manhattan to, they were buying, second homes in suburban areas, if you want. That's about the only thing that I had heard of, and I think this thesis is highly overblown. And again, I mean, we're talking about, you know, the pandemic. The vaccine is getting its approval in multiple countries as we speak. So I think it's going to end up being a short-lived one. And second, I think the different ways by which cities of comparable densities have fared, and even cities that are denser but with the better quality built environment, have managed to totally control COVID. Again, you know, it's the Singapores, the Seouls, etc. And it's a combination of the built environment, but also a way a population is drilled, you know, into, you know, wearing masks and, you know, doing the right thing and you know, following what government says, as opposed to making mask wearing a political statement like other countries that we know of. So in my opinion, you know, cities, and especially those with higher population density, are not necessarily worse off and are facing that, if you will, elite exit. And second, what the examples that Judy has showed and the example that I have showed have demonstrated that cities have done a lot of those needed improvements on the cheap. I mean, adding a bicycle lane, widening a sidewalk, blocking an area of the street, doing some tactical urbanism to insert a park, to you know, readjust traffic circulation, to make it more one-way, pedestrianizing a few streets. I mean, there's lots of, you know, thinking about urban agriculture in abandoned sites, you know, under a highway, you know, there's lots of interventions in improvements that would have a sanitary impact, that would have a livability impact, that do not necessarily need important outlays in terms of investments. And then lastly, I mean, and this is particularly the case in Brazil. I mean, places like Sao Paulo and Rio and many other cities in Brazil have never really relied on, you know, IPTU or property taxes to finance infrastructure services. They've relied on urban operations, on selling additional construction rights, which is the CPACs, so the sale of development rights. They've relied on outorga onerosa, and which is the right of densification against which you pay. So they've always made you pay for urbanizing type arrangement, and this is the arrangement that has financed these services. It's all the land value capture mechanisms. It's the betterment levies, it's the CPACs, etc. So the mechanism by which infrastructure improvements were being financed was not contingent on, you know, the ability, if you will, to retain, you know, the rich because it's their property taxes. It's transforming the additional development rights and monetizing it and sharing part of it with the infrastructure improvement. So I think from my viewpoint, I don't think that cities will end up subsidizing the rich to retain them to stay in the city. I think the cities will prevail. I mean, the built environment will have to adapt, and there will be much more premium on livability. And part of that will involve, you know, investing in, and don't forget that the cheapest and most impactful investment in slum upgrading is regularizing land tenure. It's distributing titles to people, because then they start investing in their housing, which they would never do if they're insecure about their property tenure. Judy, I'm sure you have a lot to add on.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I completely agree with Sameh. I wonder to what extent this notion that, you know, there's going to be a mass migration out of cities is a little bit overblown. I mean, we do hear about cases, people leaving New York. That's the one we hear mostly about, or even here in Washington, you know, maybe people moving a little bit to the suburbs, to bigger spaces. But I you know, they're relatively smaller numbers, and I don't think overall that they're going to have a huge impact on tax revenue in cities. I've also been reading about, again, following a little bit about this evolution of workspace. And yes, there will be companies that have determined that no, they're just going to let people work from home going forward. You know, Google and I forget the others, but there's a few big companies like that. But that being said, I think there will continue to be the need for people to go to offices, to interact, to rely on services in cities. So I think overall, we won't necessarily see, I'm hoping that actually this whole experience will end up improving the quality of cities. And again, some of the investments that we've seen in the bike lanes and the parks, and there's a lot of them coming from all over the world. So I think these are positive outcomes, closing off streets to make them more pedestrian friendly, opening up sidewalk restaurants and cafes more so, moving away from car-centric cities. So I think these are opportunities that will improve livability in cities and create new opportunities that maybe we didn't anticipate. On the issue about different levels of governments, I mean, in the challenges, I think this is one of the things that has struck me as the most surprising in this pandemic is how, I started when I was presenting on this, how differently cities and local and regional governments and national governments are responding. And again, I draw from the US because I've been stuck at home for all these months, but it is remarkable to see how divergent the experience is and how states are handling things. And then within states, it's counties, and then within counties, it's, even at the neighborhood level, some of the things that I see are remarkable to me, that, how some governors are saying, no masks, and others are saying masks are mandatory. It is quite something. And in the countries where we're working, they maybe it's a little bit less so, but I think it all comes back to what's happening at communities. And it also links back to the point that I made on information. So a lot of it has to do with getting the right information out to people, working together at the local level to make sure that people are informed about the pandemic, about the responses, about where to get assistance, about changing behaviors, and then creating some incentives that will be credible so that people can follow up. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Sameh, I don't know if you want to add to Judy's comments. I know you have to leave to another meeting, so I don't know if you want to add some last comments before you have to leave.
There's nothing to add. I mean, that was the perfect answer from Judy. So thanks a lot. Thanks, Lorena. Thanks to the professors and to the students. Sorry, I need to excuse myself here.
No, okay. Thank you so much. It was great to have you. So Judy, I'm wondering if we can go back to a little bit to talk more about slums. One of the questions that came through was about the 2030 agenda. And this is my last question. Then I'll let see if Joka and Esther want to add questions. But we talked a little bit about that the agenda for 2030 was to upgrade slums. And can you give us an idea of, since that goal was set, how much progress was made? So in other words, how ready were do we know if places where there was upgrades made in slums and there was significant progress prior to the pandemic, if those areas have fared better off, and we can see differences emerging in terms of the differences that are occurring where there was upgrading that had taken place? And can you also give us an idea of, since we're only 10 years away from the goal, how far are we in terms of the goal and the gap?
Thank you. So unfortunately, I don't have all the numbers. To be honest, one of the challenges, going back to the information point, is that one of the challenges always is having good data on what's happening on the ground. We have made some good advances in using geospatial information for slum mapping and using remote sensing. So that's been a big advancement, but overall it is difficult to track. But I will say that so it is remarkably challenging to do slum upgrading. I would say that, and again, I've worked all over the world. When I've gone to cities and you talk to mayors and cities officials, or at the national level to finance ministers, they have a notion that if you invest in slums, it means that more people are going to come to cities, and there's going to be problems of congestion and more slums. So it's sort of an old mindset that people are stuck in, because we know that people are going to come to cities because there are opportunities there, not because you've upgraded a slum, but because there are jobs and maybe better services, but you would want that for your population anyway. Better schools, better health clinics, clean water. So it has been a challenge to convince many countries to invest in slums. And I say that, over time, Brazil has been an exception, because you have had your programs over time that have invested in slum improvements, and there are some very good experiences. I would also point out another country that has really been able to go to a national level scale. And these are unusual cases. There's a very small handful of countries that have committed to upgrading and have made the investments. And that's Indonesia, a place where I've worked for a long time. Started with small programs, very community focused, and is now scaled up to be at the national level. They have a national level program. They're improving slums across the country. And over the pandemic, we have seen that these communities are able to fare better than they would have. We don't have 100% evidence, because we're not able to do the full kinds of impact evaluations that you would need to examine this, but they're more resilient because they have access to basic services. They have the infrastructure to be able to socially distance. The communities are organized thanks to the investments that were made in community participation. Health workers are able to connect and get in there and help. Information is being shared. So these are some of the benefits that we are able to see over time with such investments. Looking ahead, I'm not sure if we're going to meet the goals. I'd like to believe so, but as I started by saying, it's a tough sell for many cities. It's not always resources that are the constraint. It's really the political will to make the decision that these low-income populations have a right to the city, and these investments are worthy to make for the long-term development of a country or a community. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Esther, Jacques, I don't know if you guys want to add any questions or comments. I have a couple more, but also I wanted to make sure that we could open and that other people could ask and comment. So let's see. I think I'll continue then. Just really quickly to ask a couple of questions. One of the things we had a couple of during this course, we've had a couple of researchers who have presented data talking a little bit about the resilience of communities and community organizing, and actually how communities have had to organize because of the lack or the absence of services in their areas. And the absence of services has made communities mobilize, or had to mobilize, in the case of that we heard about in this class, was particularly around the issue of the community of Paraisópolis in Sao Paulo, where the community even purchased ambulances, invested in testing, really undertook a lot of efforts to supersede what should be provided by public services. So I'm wondering if you've seen, or if you can talk a little bit about this issue of this tension of communities organizing. On the one hand, it's very important. It's important for resilience and for improving the ability to avoid transmission and treat and guarantee treatment and also get out information in low-income communities. But on the other hand, it is also absolving authorities sometimes that NGOs are having to take the lead in these communities because of the absence of the state. And so is there things that you've identified that helps to mobilize or that's helping to create more partnerships between community organizing and the state? And how is that working? Or have you identified any initiatives where that's occurring, where it starts as a community mobilization and the government is collaborating with those communities?
So there's a couple of perspectives here. The first is that there are some countries where community participation and non-governmental organizations involvement have a long history that's deep-rooted and very active. I gave the example of India, and there are many countries in the world where, over time, community groups have basically had to step up because the state cannot meet the needs. So in those places, it's working, and it, of course, in a perfect world, the public system could provide a stronger role. But if the system is working, then it's a good thing, and it needs to be part of any solution, both in the short and longer term. I can remember working in Haiti, for example, where the state had completely not been able, this is many years ago, could not deliver basic services. And over time, NGOs had stepped in and played that role very effectively. So when we came in and tried to support government with programs and policies going forward of how to meet the needs, the basic needs of the population, that became part of the solution. No, these groups are providing local services and they maybe need additional training, additional resources, but they are the workers on the ground. They are closest to the communities and they can deliver. So we should work with them. So I would say in this pandemic, it's the same thing for countries and cities and communities that have these strong groups. This is a huge advantage, and it's something to leverage. I would also say it's important to remember that the public sector has been completely overwhelmed by what is happening. Nobody really anticipated this, even if there were all kinds of task forces over the years to, imagine scenarios of the pandemic. I don't know that any of us were prepared for what happened, and maybe this would be something good that will come out of it, that we'll all be prepared for the next crisis. But I think it is only fair to say that no, many municipalities and regional and local governments and at the national level are doing the best that they can, but the resources are limited. People are sick, people are stuck at home. And so it really is important to remember that before placing blame on who might have, dropped the ball. And so I think hopefully coming out of this will be strong partnerships that will continue to grow over time, perhaps a better appreciation of what local groups are and can do under crisis situations, and perhaps better preparedness going forward, and investing in things that can build resilience. So, we talked about what can be done at the community level, but also, for municipalities and governments, investing in having these good plans, building up capacity, having better information systems. These are all things that over time should help. Thank you.
Wonderful, Judy. So we're at the time that the class is 90 minutes and we're at the point of the end of the class. So I want to just end by thanking you again. It's really, really important for us. We wanted this course to be about talking about the pandemic in a global context and hearing about experiences in other developing and developed countries. And it's been really important to us to have both of you here presenting and being a part of the class. So thank you very much.
And thank you. It was a great pleasure to present and join you today. So everyone stay safe and take care.
Take care. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.